welcome and good evening, good day, depending on where you are in a different time zone. My name is Laura Boyce. I'm with the American Friends Service Committee, and I want to welcome everyone who's joining us today to our session today on community safety beyond policing and how to talk about it. Glad that so many people are interested in learning how to talk about it in your communities. If you have not already done so, if you're just joining us, if you could please be so kind as to put your name and your location in the chat so we can all have a sense of who's with us today. Because we're going to be talking to each other. This is not just going to be a talk at you moment. It's going to be an opportunity for us to talk with each other and learn together. So it's going to be helping us to understand who we are and what we're doing. But let me tell you a little bit about the Community Safety Beyond Policing Initiative. It's a new project for AFSC. We thought it was important in our work because we have for many years been working against all forms of state violence. We understand that safety, to have true safety, that there's a lot of benefits to having true safety, and we also believe that it is something that is beyond policing, which is what many people think of when they think safety. They think only policing as a way to create community safety. And we believe that there are other ways to achieve safety that move beyond policing. And we also understand that is, for some folks, that's a controversial notion. But that's okay. We don't shy away from controversy. We want to talk about it. We want to get it out in the open. We want to make sure people are expressing how they're feeling and getting to hear the full spectrum of what it means to look at community safety and how we achieve it. And we think it's really important that people in communities all across the country be having these conversations and getting at what really is at the heart of what they believe safety is. Before I introduce my colleague, I just want to say again that this is the Community Safety Beyond Policing and how to talk about it. And this is tonight's session is for anybody who really wants to be prepared to engage on this topic about safety, community safety beyond policing, defunding police, and any other ways that you can think about reducing reliance on police. We believe that you'll be able to get some really good skill set that you will be able to use in one-on-one discussions, or maybe in small group conversations, or maybe you even want to host your own webinar. And that would be fabulous. We'd want to know about that because we are really trying to stimulate as many of these conversations in communities as possible. So how tonight is going to work is we're going to share some content with you. We're also going to be modeling some content so that you'll understand how to do this, or it'll give you some just good examples of how to do it. You'll of course put your own stamp and flavor on it when you do it, but it'll give you enough so that you will feel comfortable, we believe, in doing this yourself. We'll be talking about best practices and facilitation, and you will absolutely tonight have an opportunity to practice in small groups. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sarah Nash, who is going to get us started for this evening. Sarah?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Perhaps like me, some of you are joining this Zoom call after a long, exhausting day. So before we begin, I'd like to invite us to just take a moment and I'll guide us through a quick grounding exercise together. So find a comfortable position and draw your attention inward. First, we consider our physical bodies, paying particular attention to any strong sensations that we may be experiencing. Notice these sensations without judgment and without the need to change anything. Now, with that same openness, we bring our attention to our breath, being aware of the sensations of each inhalation and each exhalation. With each breath, we shift our attention to this moment to this virtual space and to this group of people. We bring our attention and gratitude to the fact that we are here together, and here present with one another. Thank you all for saying yes to this invitation. We are so excited that you are here. Establishing community agreements is a vital part of any kind of conversation. And so I'm going to share a few that as a facilitation team, we've decided are important for our time together. And then I'll invite you to add additional ideas that you have in the chat, and we'll get started using that chat feature. So the first community agreement is that we are all learners. This is one of my favorite agreements because no one here is an abolition expert, and learning is a lifelong process. And so we're all on our distinct journeys, and no one individual workshop or webinar or conversation is going to solve the problems with policing in our society. So grateful we're here and that we get to learn from and with each other. The second one on our list is to create a brave space and to lean into discomfort. And so we intentionally use the word brave instead of safe. You might hear of safe spaces, but this idea of brave really gives us permission to be vulnerable with each other. And some of our best learning happens when we take risk and when we feel uncomfortable and we lean into that discomfort with each other while trying to stay fully engaged. And so I'll encourage you to begin with curiosity, to seek to understand, and to listen generously with each other. Our third community agreement is to speak from the I. And so we're going to try to share from our own experiences rather than speaking for other people or universalizing our experience, but just speak from our own lived experiences. And this fourth one is really important. It's that we want you to participate. We've designed our time together tonight to be very interactive, both in the Zoom chat feature, as well as later in Zoom breakout rooms. And we've noticed from previous webinars that we've hosted that folks tend to drop out when we break into small groups. So we're inviting you that if you're able, please stay on so we can continue to learn from and with each other in this space together. So yes, if there are anything else you think is important for our time together, I'll encourage you to hop in the chat right now and share those ideas with us. Not everybody at once. Awesome. Jonathan from Seattle says, step up, step back. It's a great one. Just noticing how much space you're taking up. And if you're somebody who takes up a lot of space, maybe stepping back so that somebody who doesn't share a lot and doesn't take up a lot of space hops in and has that opportunity too. Awesome. Folks wanting to connect with other people who are nearby them. That's great. A way to follow up with others. Awesome. That's something that as a facilitation team, we can work on. Offering each other grace and accepting grace from others. Fantastic. Oops and ouch. So acknowledging if you say something that is hurtful or harmful to somebody, acknowledge that hurt and acknowledge that harm. Receive that when somebody shares another, oops, I said something bad, and take responsibility. Mary, do you want to hop in and say, what does land the plane mean?
Oh, sure. I tend to do this. Just if you're speaking and you've made your point, you don't need to keep making it. Just try to keep it succinct.
Awesome. These are great. Thanks everybody for sharing. Lucy, awesome.
Great. So hi, everybody. I'm Mary Zirkle, and just wanted to get us thinking about, as was mentioned earlier, we're going to be going back and forth between modeling some exercises or some conversation prompts that you can use if you're kind of trying to facilitate a small group. But we also know that in those conversations, sometimes people will come up with arguments against this idea of reducing the role of policing. And so we want to build some skills for you, and you can use these in one-on-one conversations too, about how to shift the narrative and how to communicate effectively on these issues. So we're going to lay out a couple of those ideas initially so we can think about them throughout the workshop. But in the chat right now, why don't you just people are already doing it. What are the most common arguments you hear against reducing the rolls? So people are saying criminals will take over. We need to protect our communities. It would be chaos. Those are all very, yep, very somehow great. Thank you for keep going. This is great. So these are very similar things. It's a lot of fear-based narratives that it'll be chaos and really dangerous for everybody. And something to be very afraid of. And so I think we could nuance these, but the general narrative, the dominant narrative when people bring up these issues is that it's a terrible idea, it would be very scary, and that, that our communities will not be safe. So what we want to do when we get into a conversation and somebody brings up that is that we want to, you can go to the next slide, Lucy, thank you. We want to be able to counter that dominant narrative in an effective way. So one of the things we want you to keep in mind, which folks probably already know this, but it bears to repeating just right at the top of the webinar, is that defund police is something that we do want to do because, it is something that we want to do because that would help to reduce the role of policing, but we don't only want to do that. We also want to invest in things that communities need to keep themselves safe and thriving. And so the invest divest idea is a really complex idea, but that's one thing that we really need to be communicating to people when we're talking about these issues, is that the invest part is just as important as the divesting from the enormous cost of policing in many of our communities. We can see this as an action we did in Chicago because 40% or $4 million a day of our city budget goes to policing while schools and mental health clinics are being closed. So you could go to the next slide. And then some other things that we want you to keep in mind, again, just to be good communicators about this, and we're going to revisit this and give you some time to practice, but we wanted to lay this out at the beginning so you can be listening for these things and the other exercises that we're going to model. We've done some research with our fabulous research team here at AFSC. Beth Hallowell, our research director, helped us do a little message testing. And a couple of things that are good ways to shift out of that dominant fear-based narrative are to lead with shared values. Figure out what we might have in common with that person that we can apply to this situation. And we'll give you examples as we go on. Another thing that's important is to paint a compelling picture of what a community without policing would look like. And you can even share real life examples where you can of experiments that have been tried in different places. And we're going to do a little exercise around that in a bit. Another thing you can do is shift the focus to what we gain by reducing reliance on policing. What if we actually did invest in our communities and saw positive results rather than, again, this fear of like, what if we're losing this thing? And then the last thing is, just to really focus on long-term systemic change rather than reformist measures. And that's kind of a version 2 thing that we'll get into in our toolkit that we're going to share with you by the end of the week. We're not going to have as much time to talk about that today, but we do think it's important to mention. So I think now I'm going to hand it over back to Sarah.
Yep, awesome. So when having these kinds of conversations, it's really important to have some kind of like icebreaker questions so that participants can immediately and intentionally start engaging with the topic. And so for tonight, one of our icebreaker questions to get folks participating is to use the chat feature and answer the question, where are all of the places that you see policing in your community? In neighborhood, managing traffic, transit police, freeway, downtown, grocery store, standing by store entrances, parks, hospitals, at large events, rallies, protests, traffic accidents, just occasionally driving from streets. We have some folks saying not in my neighborhood, public transportation, saw a couple schools, universities. Yep, responding to mental health crises, private security at stores. Yeah, private security is another, not just at stores, but other places as well. Yeah, same. Lots of duplicate answers in all of this, and lots of places that polices are. Dunkin' Donuts, Police at Dunkin', oh, 2 Dunkin' Donuts. That's hilarious. Around homeless camps. Yes, all of these places. Responding to a neighbor who got his Trump sign run over. These are coming so fast, I'm missing some of them, so I encourage you to also be reading them. Yeah, policing everywhere, neighborhood meetings, homeless sweeps, parades. Definitely. So we have 2 more questions. Lucy, if you want to switch to the next slide. 2 more questions to help us keep dipping our toes into this really big conversation topic about community safety beyond policing. So what are some common things that people would call the police for? Before we get to the second question on the slide, we'll sit with this question for a little bit. I see gunfire, noise complaints, robberies, a cat in a tree, health emergencies, domestic violence, vandalism, fireworks, assault, carjackings, traffic accidents, folks having mental health crises. Yeah, strangers in your neighborhood or unfamiliar people, picnics, parks, parties, and parades. Got some alliteration going from Tom. Someone collapsed on the street. If a car is parked somewhere it shouldn't be, stolen packages, sudden unexpected death, getting locked out of your car. Yep. For sex workers, people experiencing homelessness who are really anywhere, children coming home late, not knowing where your child is. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing and participating so actively so early on. That we'll jump to the second question on this slide. What are some common beliefs, assumptions, or myths held by people that would lead them to call the police for some of these things? That the police will help, that they offer protection, that it's safe, that the police are there to help, that police can fix anything, that there's no one else to call, that there are no other options, that they have the best training to respond, that they have authority. That they're powerful and have the tools to find out or to know everything, that they know what they're doing, that they will de-escalate a situation. Yep, these are spot on, you all. Awesome. Lucy, you want to hop to the next slide? So at the beginning of this exercise, I shared just about how important it was to have these kind of icebreaker type questions so that folks could quickly jump into conversation. But I want us to think a little bit about why that's important. So what did we learn about each other from these questions and from reading each other's answers? That's another question that I'd like you all to answer in the chat. That we're a well-informed group, that there are answers all over the place. There are a lot of myths about policing, that we need trust to share, definitely. That we're socialized to rely on police. I think some of y'all might have been looking at our notes. You are spot on with where we're headed in the conversation. We have different perspectives, some common perceptions about policing. It's going very fast. Yes. We can try to slow down. We also have a lot of things we're trying to fit in a short period of time. common threads in overall communities for personal and property safety. The assumption that police are trained well, definitely. So a lot of what these answers are about why we ask these questions kind of center around like learning about who our audience is, right? And so there's been lots of different answers about where people saw policing in their communities and why people would call the police. And so as a facilitator, knowing who is in your audience and who you're having a conversation with is really important, because something that we know is that our experiences and our interactions with police can vary greatly depending on our different social identities and depending on our different social locations. And so as a white woman with class privilege who grew up in the suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky, my experience with policing looks significantly different than my husband, who is a Black Zimbabwean immigrant who currently lives in St. Louis City. However, if I was only having this conversation about policing with other white folks who have class privilege, it might never occur to me that folks with other social identities have had different experiences. Although our experiences of policing in the United States are drastically different, they're both also real and they're both important to have a part in these conversations. And so as facilitators, we must know whose voices and experiences are represented in our conversations and whose we might be intentionally or unintentionally excluding in those conversations. So again, thank you all for participating. I'm gonna pass it to Lucy now.
Thanks, Sarah, very much. And that what Sarah said at the end of that about your social location is what we're about to dive into a lot more deeply. How we understand the policing is, and the questions of, do police really foster safety? Safety from what and safety for whom are really, really important questions. And it's real important, like AFSC is an abolitionist organization, and the prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And that's a really important definition to lift up. And we're gonna dive into that. And what does that actually look like? We're gonna share a video and an exercise that explores these differential experiences of policing and how people experience them really, really differently. And as Sarah so eloquently spoke about her husband and her own experiences, these are gonna be really, really different. And obviously, some people see police as protectors and helpers, and generally Black and people of color do not see them. They see them as threats. And we're just gonna share a video of our coworker, Lewis, who's actually here. But the reason we're gonna share a video instead of his direct testimony is we wanted to provide a tool for you all that you could take out into the world and share with other people in your own community conversations.
So my name is Lewis, and I want to re-welcome you all to this Train the Trainer session on how to talk to your communities and your loved ones about a world without policing. We've all been exposed to the calls to defund the police and to envision community safety, that does not include policing. And these are very important conversations for us all to have. I think the challenge that we face, however, is who's part of the conversation. Very often our communities are very similar to us, and so we have these conversations without having the full story in front of us. So what I'm hoping to do with this presentation is to bring a perspective that might not be at your tables when you're having these conversations or in your community meetings. And it's my perspective. It's the perspective of a Black man born and raised in New York City, who's had the pleasure of raising 3 young Black men. And when we think about policing and the calls to defund the police and otherwise vision a world without policing, it has a very unique and important meaning to me and my community. That meaning is really informed both by the history of policing in the United States and the current realities that I and my children and my community face. So I welcome the opportunity to share that perspective with you and hope that you receive it in the spirit of um, usefulness, and that when you do have the conversations that we are helping you prepare for, that the perspective of all people are given space and heard. And so, when I think about policing, I'm forced to look at its history, and it's not a very pleasant history for members of the Black community. It's one that originates with slavery. The patrols were one of the clearest ways to maintain our lack of humanity. The slave owners created this force called slave patrols to to make sure that we remained in slavery. It threatened us, it captured us, it beat us, and it killed us, all to support the institution that has been part of our history for all too long. So understanding policing with that perspective brings me to a difficult place. It is super hard to appreciate what policing is supposed to be when its origin for my community is so horrific. That origin, certainly feeds and dominates the policing of today in Black and brown communities. They're not the officer friendly that many of us, or many of you, I suspect, may have experienced both growing up and currently in your very different communities in the Bronx, New York. For us, police are often an occupying force, a force that is here to control us, to dehumanize us, and to stymie our sense of hope. And it does a very good job, unfortunately. Now, we can certainly talk statistics and lift up some of the most horrific and well-publicized stories behind the abuses of policing in the inner city. But I think it's also important to talk about the untold stories, those day-to-day realities that I and my children have lived. I'm raising 3 young men. 2 have entered adulthood, and 1 is struggling through the early stages of teenagehood. But in all of their realities, policing has not been the most positive experience. And so what I'd like to share with you over the next few minutes is just some of those examples of why I and we join the call to defund the police and urge us all to really strongly envision a world where our community struggles are not responded to by an occupied armed force, but by a spirit of transformation and healing that will truly ensure community well-being and the safety that we all strive for. So the first story I'd like to share is one that reminds me of how early in the lives of my children policing showed up. And it was when my then 14-year-old son shared with me that he does not understand why I and many others are fighting stop and frisk. He said to me that that's what police do. It's their responsibility to keep us safe. And the way they do it is to make sure that we're not doing anything wrong. And to hear that, to hear the perspective that police are there to monitor them, it's hard for a parent to hear. It's hard for us to respond to, because that's not the officer friendly that many of us have come to think about when we think about law enforcement. It is a challenge to your humanity. It is a challenge to your value to society, where you have to live in a community where you are inundated with police forces that don't trust you and monitor you and randomly stop you and challenge your existence. That's why we have to reimagine policing in the United States, because too many young Black men, young Black children are experiencing this world in a way that that leaves them feeling less valued than they should. I also have an older son who many years ago experienced policing in a very different way. It's what we call now the school to prison pipeline. But to be searched essentially by police every day when he went to school is one more example of how policing shows up in my community. And as you all go into these conversations, it's important to understand that the policing that you know is very different than the policing that I and my children know. To be told that you cannot even enter your school without being checked is one more indicator that policing is designed to control and dehumanize young Black men. And it works. It works. And the legacy of that is one that is frightening to all of us. My youngest son, who's 13 and experiencing all of the challenges of entering young adulthood, biological challenges, social challenges, and in the midst of a pandemic, is at the point where mom and dad don't have all the answers, but yet he has all the questions. And as we've all experienced the horrific killing of George Floyd, he came to us and he said, what's going on? Why do the police hate us so much? That's the reality that many members of my community are experiencing on a daily basis. And so as you go into these conversations, these important conversations around policing and the possibility of a world where it doesn't exist the way it does now, I just ask you to welcome this perspective to those conversations, to give it space, and to take the steps necessary to ensure that policing as you experience it need not be as different as the policing that I and my children experience. Because, that's not the world that I want to live in. And I trust it's not one we all want. So thank you for this opportunity to be heard and to bring a perspective that might not show up in your community and family conversations. Let's do it, guys. Let's get to a place where we can care for each other without the need for the dangers of policing as it often shows up. And I want to thank you and would welcome future conversations and ways to contribute to this effort. So on behalf of AFSC, thank you. And we look forward to hearing how those conversations go.
So I want you for a minute to just take a deep breath and take in what Louis shared, and take in the day-to-day reality that he described. Now we're going to take a deep breath. And I really appreciate Louis being vulnerable and sharing those more personal stories with us. So this is an image of a suburb. And now that you have heard firsthand testimony of Louis telling of his and others' lived experiences of policing, you're going to delve into how different that is from those who live in white neighborhoods or suburbs. Here's an image of a white suburb. Some of these are older images, obviously. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like to put your answers to each of them in the chat. Sarah's going to read them, and then we'll respond and talk about each of those. So I want you to think about the question: in a suburb or predominantly white neighborhood, how often do you see police cars patrolling?
Eric said rarely, seeing some almost never, some not very often. Yeah, almost no police cars. Occasionally, you see a daily. It's not common all the time. If pulling a motorist over, regularly for traffic, not patrolling, but only if the police are called.
Right. And thank you. In the white neighborhood that I grew up in, Omaha, Nebraska, we very, very rarely saw police. And for those instances that you mentioned. So I want to ask another question. When a white kid in the suburbs gets caught with marijuana or another drug, what's the most likely thing to happen to him, her, or them?
Parents get called. They're slapped on the wrist. A deal is cut with somebody that they know. Nothing. They might be arrested and taken in. Lots of parents being notified and police staying with the young person. A soft reprimand. Charges getting dropped. If it happens at school, there might be a suspension or a fine. Might be sent to a restorative justice program.
Yeah, great. So definitely, like, the police and incarceration is not the first thing that happens. My brother, when he was 12, got caught with marijuana in a junior high school. He was expelled for one term and then he was reinstated. And so I think that, yeah, the differential experiences is really clear. How common are police in schools in suburbs or white neighborhoods?
Now it's very common, and right after that, not common. Would you repeat the question, Lucy? There's been an ask to
How
repeat the
common are
question.
police in schools in suburbs or white neighborhoods?
They're super common.
Escalated in schools in general, but yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, it says that they're super common in white neighborhoods that someone's at now. Yeah, there's an officer assigned to every school in a district. There are a few.
Think about also a private school, a private white school.
Yeah, I can share that from my personal experience at the almost exclusively all white Catholic high school that I attended in the suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky. There was never a police officer there.
And my son went to a private largely white school, and there was very limited security. I think there was security at night. So when you get pulled over by a cop as a white person, what's your assumption about what might happen?
Yeah, ticket and fine. There were 5 tickets right in a row. A ticket at worst, maybe a warning or a ticket, a scolding.
Great, yeah. So you've seen for yourself how different the apprehension of the role of police are in a white neighborhood and why white folks have such a different understanding of their role. And it's really critical as you move into these conversations that you have an awareness of how your experience may not be universal, and to ground your conversations in the experience of BIPOC, like we just heard, and really have an awareness of that difference. So really quickly, what did we do that made this a helpful part of the conversation? I'm going to reflect for just a minute. You can put that in the chat and Sarah will read it.
Folks feel engaged. It got people thinking.
And include Lewis's storytelling too, not just this piece.
Helps us become conscious of our lived experience. The question about what is BIPOC? So Black or Indigenous person of color is the acronym of BIPOC. The question is what was helpful about having Lewis's segment and then the conversation. It grounds us and connects us to our own experiences and emotions. Thinking about how to use this in other conversations makes us aware of differential policing. Lewis's perspective was helpful. Lewis got a lot of love after after his video played. So thank you, Lewis, again.
Great. And this is a real way to connect the system to the personal, and also to think about, you know, I think one of the things that I found really helpful is to think about that there are real borders between Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, and the police are there. Like when Lewis said that it felt like an occupying force, that police are there to enforce a little bit of a border that's there, or sometimes something that's perceived to be more. And then a shared value that you can put forward is that everyone deserves to feel safe in their communities and have enough resources to thrive. Oh, I didn't need to do one more thing for you before so this is, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez was asked, what does a community with defunded police look like to you? And this is what she said. I'm gonna move this over so I can read this. Affluent white communities already live in a world where they choose to fund youth, health, housing, etc., more than they fund police. These communities have lower crime rates, not because they have more police, but because they have more resources to support healthy society in a way that reduces crime. When a teen or preteen does something harmful in a suburb, I say teen because this is often when lifelong carceral cycles begin for Black and brown communities. White communities bend over backwards, as we talked about, to find alternatives to incarceration for their loved ones, to protect their future, like community service or rehab or restorative measures. Why don't we treat Black and brown people the same way? Why doesn't the criminal system care about Black teens' futures the way they care for white teens' futures? Why doesn't the news use Black people's graduation photos or family photos and stories the way they do when they cover white people, like Brock Turner, who commit harmful crimes? Affluent white suburbs also design their own lives so that they walk through the world without having much interrupt or interaction with police at all, aside from community events and speeding tickets. And many of these communities try to reduce these too. Just starting there would be a dramatically and radically different world than what we're experiencing now. So really thinking about what makes communities safe, and that in these communities with these white communities, there's a lot more resources is really important. And that we all really, and as a shared value, everybody deserves to feel safe in their communities and have enough to live. And this is a vivid image of the differential between the two. And thank you so much. And Lewis, you turned on your camera. Do you want to add anything? You're muted. We still can't hear you, unfortunately. We still can't hear you, unfortunately. We'll come back to it. All right.
So just want to revisit one of the talking points that we talked about earlier of how important it is to paint a compelling picture of what communities could look like without police. We often focus on the ideas of divestment and deconstruction, and we often don't spend the same amount of time of using our creativity to imagine what could be. And so I think we have found in our own work at AFSC that both are vital to this work, right? We have to have power analysis and think about what isn't working at the same time as we have to hold space to think about what could be different. You know, Angela Davis asked the question, are prisons obsolete? Which pushes us to say, you know, like, wait a second, can we imagine something that we haven't actually experienced yet? And so we have to tap in. Children are really good at this, and we lose it as adults, I think. But spending time playing in our imagination and using that creativity.
So we're gonna break out into our first small group session now, Do you want to go ahead, Sarah?
Sure. You want to switch the slide?
Okay. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're going to do our first breakout session. So I hope everybody is excited. There's a series of prompts on the slide. I'm not going to read them to you. Feel free to read them. Mary's also going to put them in the chat because we're going to invite you to think about these prompts and to brainstorm with each other about how we can approach these situations without using police. So now I'm inviting you to tap into that childlike part of yourself and to use your imagination and creativity to think about how we can approach these situations without using police and instead use resources to tackle the root causes of the problem. And so how we're going to do this, there are going to be, I think you'll be randomly assigned to either a pair or a group of 3. Again, making the encouragement and invitation to not resist the urge to sign off right now and to participate and to learn from and with each other. You'll be randomly assigned to a breakout room number, and we're asking that you talk about the prompt that has the same number as the last number of your breakout room. So for example, if you're in breakout rooms 2, 12, 22, 32, or 42, you all will be discussing prompt 2. Same thing for room 7, 17, 27, 37, and 47. You're gonna talk about prompt 7. It's a little different, so I'm gonna say it again. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. There's no 0 prompt, which means that you're gonna do prompt 10. And Mary, I think, you'll drop those prompts in the chat. And Lucy, you want to talk about what they're going to talk about?
Yeah, for each of these, you're going to take the time. We're going to give you a bit of time to really dive into each of these scenarios and think about what is the root cause of the conflict issue or question that you're looking at. What do you think could be the best approach to reacting to it in a life-affirming, care-centered way? And what is the type of solution that could help prevent this from occurring in the future? We've seen in the earlier chat was really clear that police are called for so many issues. And so this is really a chance to imagine how we would respond in a different way. Okay.
So we want to just take a moment. There was a lot happening in the chat that the facilitators were able to catch up on because as we facilitate the Zoom, we have our Zoom up, we have our run of the show where we're keeping time, and then we have we see you all and the chat, and so we had time to touch base, and we think that we're just going to kind of talk with each other for a minute about how. What is a helpful skill set and tool set to handle situations like this? Because we want to name that interpersonal conflict is very difficult to facilitate over a webinar with over 100 folks in it, and that the chat we want folks to be open to listening and to learning and to engaging. That's our hope for the space, and that it was distracting that while Lewis was speaking on the video, that all of that chat was happening. And so Mary and Lucy, just want you all to hop in and to share what are some helpful tools, techniques, and strategies for when conflict arises, because it's not an if, it's a when. When we say yes to having these conversations, conflict is going to come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always great when people have questions and they share them in a group. But if those questions then tend to take over the discussion instead of other things, what was difficult in this situation is that we had a learning session going on simultaneously. If we're in a room all together, it's a little bit easier because we're all talking together and we can try to unpack it together. Sometimes I think it's really healthy when other people in the group then take on that person's questions, which I saw happening in the chat, which I thought was really healthy. It just becomes a little bit more difficult in this Zoom phenomena. Sometimes in situations like this, I might step aside with the person who has a lot of questions. It's persisting and not letting the rest of the session move forward. And sometimes we can, have a discussion offline that lets the rest of the group move forward. Lucy, how about what ideas do you?
I think all those ideas are really good, and I couldn't see the chat, so like sometimes you might want to choose to pause and interrupt even in this kind of big session. But I do agree, like really trying to keep the focus while addressing, finding a way to address that person directly is really important and really helpful. So
yeah. And I think it's again, since we're trying to model things, this is a good a thing to happen in a session. Like we're saying, you're possibly going to be talking about a subject that might be controversial in your community, and so there may be people with questions that takes the conversation off track. And then how do you get it back on track so that we can all be doing what we came here to do? And so those are some tips. It's a little bit difficult with the Zoom thing. I think people were encouraging us to stop the chat during the presentations, but it's kind of hard because we're using the chat as a way to communicate with you all, but something to think about. Other strategies that you have, Sarah?
No, I think all those points are helpful, and to keep us on time. That was really important, I think, to hold that space in that conversation. But I want to make sure we get to the other pieces. So I think we'll move along. Awesome. So we're curious to hear what were some of the interesting ideas using that childlike creativity in your small group. What were some of the interesting ideas that came up in your groups? So if you would share that in the chat, I will do what I feel like I've been doing all night, which is reading your answers out loud.
thank you, Sarah.
Yes. Okay, let's see. Distressed individual, non-law enforcement mental health crises, or a crisis response team. Yeah, folks need a broader familiarity. Oh, now it's all disappearing because they're all happening at the same time. Yeah, folks, general public need a broader familiarity with disabilities and mental crises because there are many simple and kind ways to respond that don't involve calling the police. Lots of appreciation for group members. We love to see that. Assuring that there are community centers where people can be. Figuring out ways to deal with situation ourselves and to not involve law enforcement. I think that's great. Invest in a different kind of 3-digit number that can be called for mental health crises. Believing the victim. 911 responders need more choices. So I think our system right now, it defaults to police. And so having other ways. Looks like one of the groups that had the break light question agreed that having an armed person is not required to respond. However, it's hard to know how to address without some form of observance or surveillance of the broken brake light. Let's see. Some root causes: poverty, desperation, idle hands, nothing to do for youth, lack of positive role models, showing affirmatively saying no to peer pressure, economic disparities. All these questions or answers are pouring in. Mandatory bystander training, because bystanders need to give the victim the benefit of the doubt. That got a thumbs up from Lucy. Yeah, these are great. I'm going to encourage you all to also read through some of these answers. Better schools with peer-to-peer counseling, job training, need for less guns. So that kind of getting to the source of, decreasing the number of guns on the street.
Yeah, I want to tell 2 stories that happened in Philadelphia. So I live 12 blocks from where Walter Wallace was killed by the police. And he was in a mental health crisis. So that's obviously one where those alternatives that you were saying need to happen. And then also we had a big houseless encampment here, and the rich people who were really near, the people that were really near the houseless encampment wanted the police to come and just dismantle it. And because of activism and people protesting, they waited. And they worked out a deal with the mayor that these people would receive a lot of housing. And in West Philadelphia, not far from where I live, is a little tiny house village that's going to be created for houseless. So there was an agreement to give a whole bunch of empty houses to the houseless people. So that's an example of a kind of solution that's beyond policing as well. And we'll see how it actually works out, but that agreement was, I think, a very powerful one. So you all imagined some really powerful solutions that could be alternatives that would keep us all safe. And I love that people mentioned bystander intervention and like, what would it mean if we all understood ourselves as keeping each other safe instead of calling and knowing our neighbors? And here are some alternatives that exist that we've seen before. So do you want to go ahead and take care of these, Sarah?
Sure, yeah, and just want to name that this is part of a really incredible series, and it was difficult for the team to figure out which two we wanted to include on the slide. But as part of the toolkit, we're going to offer you all of these images to really think through. So the first is to imagine that you are experiencing a mental health crisis and you're afraid. Imagine if you could call a 311 number and a first responder trained in mental health came to your door. And that 1 hour later, you are in a safe place with your consent, with plans for follow-up care. The second image reads, incidents of gun violence are rising in the neighborhood. And imagine if a trauma-informed crisis intervention team works with community activists to disarm and de-escalate conflicts, that people doing harm are connected to services that address underlying problems. Yeah, isn't that public safety is the question that both of these images end with. And so, yeah, what did you find? Did you find that this sort of space was a generative space to think about alternatives? All right, I'm seeing lots of comments, sort of going back to the earlier comment and thread. And so I want to ask us to sort of lean in to the remainder part of the conversation and trust that the facilitation team is going to address this and reach out. We really don't want the rest of our time together to be derailed. And so really wanting to ask us to kind of come back in to this presentation. So I'll ask again, in your small groups, did you find that you experienced a generative space to think about alternatives to tap into that childlike creativity? Yes, folks saying it was generative. Good conversations. The process is too rushed. Would you all believe that we cut a lot out to make it less rushed? Yeah, which is why we're sending you a thorough toolkit that you can use to figure out what timing is going to be helpful in your own communities. Too short, yes. We would love to give everybody 30 minutes in breakout rooms.
And what would it take to make these solutions a reality?
Money. Yeah, money is definitely something. Will, also very important. Willingness to change. I think like mass, like public education, right? Like really, I believe we have everything that we need. We just need to figure out how to use that. truth and reconciliation process for the United States. A lot, definitely. Trained people, for sure. Value clarification, imagination, willingness to take chances with something new. That's really important.
Yeah, and also just I think that in Minneapolis, some of the things that they're doing is they're really getting to know their neighbors. Like just really shifting community is another really important part. Like people feeling really connected to each other is also a really important beginning to this. All right. Should I go ahead? Anything else, Sarah?
Nope. Yeah, more responses are coming in, and yeah, maybe there's a way that we can compile it later.
Thank you for that. That's really, and the beginning of this change is really comes from imagination. And if we can't imagine it, we can't build it. And so that's really, and it's really important for you to exercise that capacity and do it with each other.
Okay, I'm going to add one more because I think this is really important. Actively seeking the youngest among us to lead the effort and accepting their leadership. That is so important, and a key value that AFSC has in our work is that we follow young people. They are the visionaries. And yeah, they have that creativity that is so, so important.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Yeah, thank you. This group is really amazing. We've had, can you back it up one? Yeah, we just had so many amazing ideas in that. This chat is invaluable. Look, we're definitely going to save it. So to sort of wrap up, and clearly we could spend a whole day together. We're just giving you some tools here that you can use if you're going to hold these conversations yourself. We're going to back it up with a toolkit. But one of the things we wanted to teach you some skills in is, again, how to shift out of that narrative. So we kind of established at the beginning that the dominant narrative around these issues is a fear-based narrative. It's that scary things are going to happen if we start to reduce our reliance on policing or defund police. We kind of talked about how we want to also talk about investing in the things that communities need, but then, some other ideas that are messages that are very effective when communicating about these things. And so what I want to try to teach you now is some skills, and then we're going to practice them, but we have some sort of best practices. If you go to the next slide, we've done this narrative shift work for a number of years at AFSC and around lots of different issues. And there's a couple of tried and true techniques that when you're talking about any issue, I did a lot of workshops around trying to change the narrative on anti-Muslim racism. And it works for that. It works if you're trying to change somebody's making a comment about immigrants that you want to move them in a different direction. All these little 4 tips I'm going to tell you about in a second can work for all of those things. So one is just don't get trapped in that dominant narrative by accepting the framing or the language that's been put forward. And this is my favorite little clip of my friend Huda, who is over there on the right. And she is an Iranian American fashion blogger. And she was on this TV show talking about her fashion line. And they started to ask her about Iran's nuclear weapons. And she gave them some answers that they didn't like. And they said, "You don't sound American. You don't even sound American." And her answer was, "That's because I've read." So she didn't come back and say, I am American, I'm a citizen. She didn't get trapped into the argument they were putting forward. She just slipped right out of it. And so that's what we want you to think about it. I'm going to give you some techniques to do that. Next slide, please. Lucy, next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So one good technique is to ask questions. So if somebody's coming back with the fear-based narrative that we want to move out of, you can ask some questions. Well, do you think everybody deserves to be safe? Or like, who do you mean that we're not going to be safe if we start to defund police? And this techniques just can buy you some time so that you can think about what your answer is going to be, but it also can stop the person in their tracks and then they really have to answer it. Okay, next slide, please. Another tip is just don't attack the speaker personally. So sometimes it can be these issues whenever you're dealing with a controversial issue, sometimes you can feel really upset or emotional about it. And, it can be satisfying to, call the person out or whatever. But we try to teach people not to do that, because we want to spread understanding and empathy and exchange ideas with people. And the other thing is, if you're planting, you can think about it like this: you're planting seeds every time you have one of these conversations. So if you attack the speaker personally, whoever's listening is not going to get anything out of it. But even if you don't think you can change this person's mind, if you have a legit conversation with them, somebody else might be listening and they can learn something from it. And the next one. And then listening for keywords. This is my favorite trick. And we started using this. We call it the Kellyanne Conway thing, because technique. She, I don't know if you remember, she used to be the press secretary in the Trump administration, and she would never actually answer a question. She would just find a word and then latch onto that word and then take it in a whole different direction. And so in this situation, there are lots of keywords that you could listen for, because a lot of the words that we're talking about, safety, community, healthy, those things are often used within the context of talking about, they're appropriated and they're talked about in different ways by different people. So if somebody says to you, I'm so frightened if we are defunding the police, who's going to keep us safe? You could take that word safe and ask that question. Well, doesn't everybody deserve to be safe? Or how do you think they keep us safe? You can move that in a different direction. Okay, so those are the tips. But then I also want to go back and revisit. These are our messaging tips that we've, through our research director, Beth Hallowell, we've been able to discover these messages actually kind of help if you're trying to talk about this particular subject, reducing reliance on policing. So one is, again, leading with those shared values. So we saw those emerge in a lot of our conversation as we've gone on today. And so, one of the things you could say is like, don't you agree that everybody deserves dignity and respect? Every community deserves to have what it needs to thrive. Again, thinking about that invest, divest framework as well. So that's one good way that you can have these conversations. Go to the next one. And then painting a compelling picture about what a community without policing could look like. You guys just came up with a million fantastic ideas. I mean, you all should have fantastic talking points that I'm going to steal from the next time I have one of these conversations. What could it look like? What could it look like if we did things in a different way, if we used our imaginations and thought about things differently? Go to the next one. And then shifting the focus to what we all gain by reducing reliance on policing. So again, move it out of that fear-based narrative and don't get stuck arguing with the person that it's going to be different, but shift it and say like, hey, we'd be so much healthier if we made investments in education and healthcare and housing. Wouldn't it be great if everybody on our block knew each other and we felt like we could go to each other when there were problems, things like that. And people do respond to this. This is based on Beth's research in our small groups. Okay, you can go to the last one. Oh, that's it. Okay, so there's some others, but we're going to focus on those three, and we're going to do another small group. And what I'd like you to do in the small group, I think it'll be 2 to 3 people in your group. And I'd love to do this in workshops. We haven't tried it in Zoom yet, so we'll see if it works. But in person, it's really fun to do because it's just really quick. So we're going to go in, and one person will ask the question that's in that thought bubble, and we'll put it in the chat. Defunding police is crazy. Who do they think is going to keep us safe? What's going to happen with no one to keep us safe? And then you be the person, and we're going to time it. You're just going to get a minute. Just go ahead and try to respond to that person, and then switch. And then hopefully we have time for the third person to switch. So just do it. Don't try to analyze it. Just go ahead and try to respond to that person and see what happens. You might come up with some great ideas, and then we'll pair, we'll hear if anybody came up with a good response. Okay. Now that you're all back, I'd love to hear who had a good response. Did anybody share it in the chat if somebody had a response that they thought was especially effective? Did you have a partner who gave us a good response?
Looks like community-focused interventions, that there was a big discussion about defund versus invest, divest. which I think I just want to share. I don't necessarily think that's a versus, right? I think those can coexist.
They do coexist.
They do coexist. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about reallocation rather than all of it's moving again, and I lost it.
Yeah, no, it's you guys are so fast. We're just like, what? But it sounds like really concrete ideas, like a program in Chicago that people were talking about. And I think what's the last time you used a jackhammer to hang a picture? Okay, that's a good
very visual
image there. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, talking about reallocation rather than defund opens ears. That's true.
Getting to know neighbors.
And also, people don't talk about like retraining people. Like there's I think that people get sort of like, well, what will happen to these people that are, police currently? And it's like, well, there's an opportunity to just really like give people a very, retrain them to do something else,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really important to say, like, and to be community, to help with building community safety that we're talking about.
Yeah. I love this. Somebody mentioned a Socratic dialogue, asking questions until the proclamation. Craig mentioned that. And I think that's such a great, I learned the question piece when we started first doing these narrative shift workshops from somebody who was a canvasser. So they had been in many of these kinds of discussions, and that was their magic trick. And it really does, it helps in it. And you actually have a much better conversation if you find out what the person's really thinking about. Well, these are like incredible examples. Katz, let me read Katz, told the story of a friend with mental health issues who's treated as a mental health case rather than a criminal case. But was never, I see, yes. So talking about the various race dynamics. And she ultimately got treatment and got better. So good personal stories, I think, are concrete examples are really great. So we just wanted to give you this is a little taste of this. We do this in workshops all the time, and gets really fun. The room is buzzing when you can do it with people live, and soon, hopefully, we'll be in that situation to be able to have live workshops again. But hopefully you'll find this information helpful when you're having your conversations one-on-one or in a group. I think we want to move now, and before we close out, just to address some of the dynamics that were going on in the chat, and we, definitely feel bad that somebody felt that they had to leave the discussion. It was kind of difficult for us as facilitators to even read the chat while we're talking, or Lucy can't see the chat because she's screen sharing. I don't know, Lucy, you were going to start this. Did you want to share?
No, just like that, when there's a sense that somebody's being harmed, like in the dynamics of this, our customary thing would be to really just pause and really ensure that that's not continuing. And I think that, and we will reach out to her and try and do a process with her. The context of this webinar and trying to share this with you, I think makes that a lot more challenging, and to confer about, okay, how do we take care of everybody at the same time? But we will reach out to her and make sure that she feels as though we've listened to her as much as possible, if she's willing, and really talk about that and what, how she would have liked to have been cared for in that moment. I think hopefully you'll be in smaller sessions than 100 people and can really turn and really care for somebody as something like this happens. And we were, that's what I would say. Any other things that Sarah or Mary you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just share. Mary kind of already touched on this, but most of us are used to having these kinds of conversations in person, and that all of us know there is a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to trying to do things that you're used to doing in person in a virtual space. And so just acknowledging that the three of us are learning as we go and learning with you all about what works and what's helpful and what isn't working. And so appreciate all the feedback that we've received so far. And the comments for us to step in and to use this as a learning opportunity. That is, we hope that we've been able to model some of what we would do if these conversations were in person, while also like having the limitation of doing it in a world where it's hard for us to stay with the PowerPoint and see the chat and respond in live time when there are four of us who are in charge of making all of that run. So
yeah, actually Becky just popped something that's a great idea, Becky. We could have gone back to the community norms. That might have been a good idea. Just be like, hey, it felt like a runaway train a little bit. And I know like if we had been in a room together, I feel like there was one voice that was really dominant, at least at one point in the chat, that was being somewhat aggressive. And like, that might've been a chance to like, I probably would have had a side conversation with that person. So anyway, friends, we all want to have good discussions together, and it's never great when somebody leaves the discussion, but I think we're learning from this, and we hope you did too. And I would appreciate your suggestions so much in the chat. So
yeah, thank you. And
yeah.
And we'd love if you have other suggestions. We're going to be sending an evaluation. You can tell us in that. But also, if we want to leave some space for questions or comments about this or about anything that you heard in the webinar.
And please join us in January. We're going to be having another discussion. This one, we're trying to get into sort of some more nuanced and complicated discussions about aspects of this whole question. So in January, we're going to be talking about alternatives to 911. So we hope you can join us there. And we'll send you a recording and all these materials and a way to reach out to us if you want to have a conversation like this in your community and how we can stay in touch.
And we still have time, so if you have questions or comments that you want to share, we'd love to hear from you.
Are we willing to post the chat log? Yeah, that's a great idea. Sure.
And if any of you have questions, we open it for you to talk as well. You don't need to just do everything in the chat too.
Okay, see, there's a couple of raised hands, but let me see.
Susan Cousins, you want to unmute and go ahead?
Sure. I'm just wondering in what settings people have used these materials and had these dialogues, particularly that are beyond our comfort zone, which for a lot of us is Quakers and heavily white Quakers. How can we reach out with them, and where have people had success on that?
So, I mean, these materials that we presented today come from a bunch of different experiences. I know in my community in Chicago, I've been having these conversations with people all summer, sometimes at mutual aid, events, sometimes with the Defund CPD campaign that we support in Chicago. Informally. So there's some of that knowledge, but then also we have been working with coalitions in different cities who've developed a lot of these conversations and have developed tools that we drew from as well. So so I think it's a mix of those kinds of experiences. And I'm not sure if you're asking like where to find a different group or how to find a different group to speak with, Susan. Yeah. I'll just say in Chicago, actually, we've been trying to go and have these conversations at mutual aid settings, because that really illustrates what community care and people helping to give people what they need. They know that's the invest part, right? Of the invest divest framework, is if you're at a mutual aid and we're giving people what they need to survive in this setting, and then people are there and you can chat about these issues. So I find that that's a useful site to do that. But I'm also planning in January and February to just through local partners to just offer to hold conversations with anybody in their various networks that are interested. So I'm going to reach out to, we have a partner that's sort of a social justice gallery, and they'll probably hold one for me. Just different places where you might draw people from other than the immediate network that you're part of, I guess.
And also, I think that if we have these conversations with the people close to us, hopefully we're equipping them to have the conversations with people in broader circles as well. So, so I would encourage just, I think that, and also there's a broad and divergent spectrum of views in the Quaker world, if you're focused in that world too. And so just having them there would make a lot of sense. Somebody said it's, in the chat said it's okay to say I don't know, which I really appreciate that. Yeah. And then Brian Kaur is raising his hand if you want to talk.
Hi, thank you. I guess I actually want to talk a little bit about sort of what happened with the chat, because I think that considering we're going to be using Zoom and similar platforms for a while, it could be really relevant if any of us are doing these sorts of things. Yeah. I think one challenge I see with, and again, I totally appreciate the limits on the ability of people to manage all these things, is that people, in my experience, and I saw this tonight from my perspective, people tend to weigh in, and then other people are trying to support one person or another, but then they reframe what people have said a little bit. And it just starts to build because people are now responding to what someone else felt someone was saying. And the other piece is that I do think that as Quakers, those of us who are Quakers, we have to try to not sort of take sides in these sorts of things, even while recognizing that there's a person who's expressing harm. I think there could be other voices who were resonating with some of the things that one set of people felt were harmful. And so it's just a plea that as we engage in this work, which is so fraught and so emotional, that we refocus on speaking for ourselves and our own experiences, which is challenging in a mostly white organization, talking about issues that we see as affecting primarily people of color. So I'll stop with that. I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you, Brian. That's really, really, really helpful.
Yeah, so helpful.
And I think Lewis was snapping his fingers for that. He also said that if you want to expand, go like these conversations, this kind of conversation is being hosted all over, and go and visit one that's being hosted by Black and Brown advocates. Movement for Black Lives is hosting this kind of thing. So, you can widen your circle in lots of different dimensions and ways. I don't know, Lewis, if your mic is.
I'm sorry, and I forgot one small thing. Okay. I saw that someone said that the chat would be shared with this publicly or whatever. And I think since people weren't told that what they were writing in the chat was going to be public, we might want to reconsider sharing it. So sorry, yeah, I think really stop now.
Thank you.
I hear you. And I think I was thinking about that too, Brian. I think what we could do maybe is pull out generically some of the ideas that people shared, but then no attribution to people's, maybe in just that section, not the other parts, but just the ideas that people generated in the small groups that thought were really generative. So maybe be able to pull those out somehow.
I also want to respond to a question in the chat about where you can find the recording and the slides and all of that. And so all of that is going to be part of this super probably long comprehensive toolkit that we're going to send out to you all. So if you registered for the event, even if you didn't attend, which all of you attended, you're going to receive this toolkit that has our outline, has our talking points, has our slides, has the Lewis video, has the recording of the event, has maybe the chat pieces that were connected to the questions. We'll have additional research for extra reading if folks wanted to do different exercises that we couldn't translate well to the Zoom world, that we would encourage you to do on your own time and in your own communities. So all of that is going to be compiled in something that we hope is useful for you as you continue to have these conversations in your own communities.
And there's a question that Karen, thank you, Sarah. And there's a question that Karen is asking, what is the role of police officers in conversations about defunding and reform? And I'm on the Philadelphia Mayor's Commission on Interfaith and Faith-Based Affairs. And actually the commission was a leader in provoking a community conversation with the mayor of Philadelphia, with the police commissioner, with some high-level inspectors and the police, with just regular people telling their stories about their experiences about policing. And And the commission that I'm on also wrote an op-ed, the Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart wrote an op-ed after Walter Wallace, and the murder of Walter Wallace was what provoked that. And to really share vulnerably. And so it is really important that we have these conversations across those. And it was very moving, very vulnerable. It's the first of several conversations that the city is going to be hosting around this. So I do think that that kind of like, that opens space for shifting hearts. And what was really remarkable was the number of police officers who talked about their own experiences as children and their own experiences that had happened being policed themselves. And so I think it's a really that's sort of the space for that. And I don't know if Rick's on, but they've done some incredible work with the police in West Virginia with the AFSC's office. I don't know if you want to share about that, Rick. Rick Wilson in that office.
Long story.
Are you open to share? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I wasn't really expecting this. In general, I think the approach here is like, at some point there needs to be a backstop if someone drives a car into a crowd of innocent people, but we need to reduce the role of coercion as close to zero as we possibly can. And there've been some efforts here to engage this and to reduce the presence. But I have to say, and our political climate here is really horrible. It's probably much worse than most people on here. So we're more in the realm of harm reduction than in doing things. But I will say this, like, if we want to move forward to this, we need to recognize the fact that there are, fortunately, very rarely, some things that really threaten people that need to be dealt with. And we can't disregard that, but we can vastly reduce the role of coercion, force, state effort in this by community-based responses, by mental health, by dealing with addiction, by all this. And I would say the biggest thing we could do, if we can reduce the degree of inequality, of poverty, and all these things, that's what really ultimately drives most of the things we're worrying about. So the more we approach a degree of social justice, the more we'll approach a degree of reducing state violence and coercion. Hope that helped. Sorry, I wasn't expecting this.
Thanks, Rick.
Well, that's great. And actually, we just decided today we're going to have a focused conversation about the economic justice aspect of this whole discussion later on in the spring. So stay tuned, everybody.
Renee, I see that you have your hand raised.
I want to respond to Mackenzie's comment really quick. She says police lie all the time and have the power to murder people who threaten their jobs. I think it's really important of that kind of level of that we are aware of the weight of police officers, but I also want to say that Reverend Naomi Washington, who's the head of this commission that I'm a part of, the faith-based, she was in these different circles and who is very is a Black Lives Matter activist herself. She was very in these circles right after Walter Wallace was murdered, and she was like, they don't have any other idea of what other things to do. And so just having a space where people are like, well, what other things can we do with people that have that responsibility, I think is really important. And Renee, go ahead, and then we're gonna close out soon.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that we need to have these conversations, not just within our community, but also with the police. In Oregon, and I know in other places, the police have town halls to meet people. It's really important that we show up at those and ask the police about their nonviolence training, their de-escalation training, and ask the questions that get them to think about what they're doing. It's really, really important. And also, I think we are afraid to take individual action. And I think individual action makes for community policing. And I gave an example when I was talking in the breakout session of a sometimes member of our meeting who saw two students handcuffed and thrown down on the street because they had been chalking the sidewalk. And there were 2 or 3 police cars there 4 or 5 policemen standing around them. And she ran into the bar next door and she said, come out and see how your money's being spent. And then she ran into a restaurant, said the same thing. Pretty soon there's a huge crowd out there. And by then there are 4 police cars, all the sirens going. It turned out these were students from the high school who had been charged with doing a project which they were doing on the sidewalk. And then she hollered, she said, what's your mother's phone number? And she called the parents. This is something we can do. We don't have to always depend on the police. And we don't always have to think that the police are the bad guys, because sometimes they lie, but a lot of times they don't. And their training is abysmal. The training that you can only pull a gun and shoot to kill, to me, is absolutely crazy, but they're all taught that. And so I think we need to be involved in police training as well. And so when we talk about defunding, I don't even like that term. You know, we can talk about refunding or we can talk about community policing, but it's so important that we individually get out there and engage all of these people, the police and the community, and not be afraid to go either alone or with friends to intervene in these things. Everybody's afraid of being involved or being hurt.
I think it's also really important to remember our social location and our experiences of policing and what they might and might not be, and that is going to shape our perception about what the solutions are, and that what we're seeking is the kind of structural change that Rick was talking about. That's the kind of thing, that's what that means. That's what shifting resources to community needs means. And also that it's really important not to forget what Lewis said in the video. This developed out of the slave patrols, and it has a certain role, and we can't assume that it's going to play a completely different role without some really deep changes. And that's what this conversation has really been about. So. And Rick says the greater degree of equality, the less coercion there is likely to be. Thank you so much. Mary and Sarah, you want to add anything before we close out?
No, I'm just very grateful for, this was a fantastic experience, and we've all learned a lot from sharing space with you all. And so we hope you're going to come to talk with us again in January, and on through the spring, we'll be doing once a month. We'll be having a little conversation. So look for us. We'll send you a thank you note with the recording and some materials, and we hope you stay in touch. We really appreciate you.
And host a conversation. Go
Yes.
do it, please.
Yes, we'd love that. So take care, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.